Hey everyone, this is Scott from certmedia.com, and in this video we are covering PageSpeed Ninja. Okay, so I'm going to start this video by saying anything that starts with Ninja or one-click solver immediately sets off my, okay, this is probably somewhat of a scam. This is not a scam though. It's an interesting plugin and it has an interesting approach to optimizing your website, but we're going to have to explain quite a few details on how this plugin works. So when you first install it, you get this nice little screen and it looks great. The user interface in this plugin is top notch, actually. I'm very impressed with it. The optimization profile preset. So this is where you can modify basically what kind of optimizations this plugin will perform by default on your website. Safe, obviously, shouldn't break stuff. Compact, optimizations that require a small amount of disk space, which is like disable image processing, loading of external URLs, blah, 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 blah. The optimal, which is the optimizations that are going to be most suited. Ultra, which is going to be the highest level of optimization, excluding experimental changes. Experimental changes are those that are probably going to break things, but they are testing them so that way they don't break things. And experimental, because I like to live dangerously, and this is a staging site, I'm going to set it to experimental. You can choose to use remote critical CSS generation, which means that the plugin will go to the PageSpeed Ninja server to generate the critical CSS. Critical CSS is basically it's your website's critical rendering path, which is the CSS that's required to render the above the fold content. The reason that you want your critical CSS generated, and if you use WordPress Rocket, this is called the optimized CSS delivery feature. It basically reads your entire CSS. It extracts what it believes will render the top half of your page, and then it loads the rest of your CSS in the footer asynchronously in a non-render blocking fashion. The process here is because CSS files by default are render blocking, by moving them to the footer and loading only what's needed to render the top half of the page, the user will get a more natural and progressive loading, which will give them a better user experience overall. It's a good thing to do, but it's hard to do on certain themes, and that's why using features like this can cause breakages. It can also get a flash of unstyled content. So that's when you visit a page and you have like a menu and the menu's all like messed up and you have like a search bar and it's moved over here and it's very odd to look at. And that's because the plugin's tool isn't able to properly generate the critical CSS. You could try regenerating it, but chances are is the theme may be using a lot of JavaScript and that's going to be the source of it. Or there's just some sort of issue with trying to get that critical CSS generated. So we're going to go ahead and use it though, because this is a staging site and I would recommend using it if it works for your site. I'm going to send the anonymous statistics and the support badge. Sure, I'll stick it on there. And then there are settings afterwards after you do this. So this is just a nice little like dashboard. So we click save. Now all of these are all the features that it actually enables, or at least tries to resolve. There are quite a bit, as we can see. So it's going to go through and try and do its biz to go ahead and fix the performance issues that are plaguing this website. This is just a WooCommerce website. And okay, so it broke some stuff. Yeah, I was expecting that, just not so soon. Let's see. Yep, there are definitely some broken things. Well, that's what happens, guys. That is what happens. It's probably just not generated yet, because as you can see, it is still trying to run through. And that's what's typically going to happen, especially because I used experimental mode and I said I like to break things. We're going to go through and jump through all of this into the advanced section. Just be forewarned that this is going to be a heavy topic. So if you just want to use the preset, go with optimal, and optimal will basically go through and turn off various settings that are prone to breakage to avoid causing issues. I'll go ahead and enable it just to show you that it's going to fix my problems. The website's problems. Looks like it's still causing a 404. Very odd. Actually, this may be a caching issue in the browser. We'll go ahead and disable cache. Cookies is not defined. Error 404. It's having some problems. This plugin is notorious for having problems, and the support page will tell you that. But let's just run through some of these things so we can begin. The enable for logged in users, as it says, will go ahead and it will enable various features for logged in users. Note that in the case page cache is disabled and other optimizations are enabled. Basically, caching the page's HTML will always be disabled, but it will enable the HTML, the CSS compressor, and the image optimization features. We're going to go ahead and you can use the HTML parser is basically just what library they're using to parse your website's HTML and to remove comments. So by default, the fast, simple HTML parser is probably the best one. You could use something like the libxml parser, which is the experimental feature, or the standard full HTML parser. Really, you're going to use whichever one your server allows you to use and will process. Oftentimes when you use features like this, the server may time out and reject the request, and you want to configure the parser that's going to be causing you the least amount of problems. The fast, simple HTML parser is probably fine for most shared hosting environments, so that's what I'm going to check. For the distribution method, this is where you can modify how your compressed CSS and JS files are served to the client. You should never use the PHP files if you can. This is a website that has Apache. So Apache mod rewrite and mod headers is definitely the recommended method. I'm actually going to save that right now, just so that way I can resolve this annoying issue over here. Yeah, we'll give it a little bit either way. So the static files directory is declared relative. So this is going to be relative to the WordPress installation directory. That's fine. HTTP to server push. Okay. So server push is a feature that was included in the HTTP2 draft, and as it mentions here, according to the W3C working draft, it basically tells the browser when it goes to download the HTML of your website, it includes links to your CSS and your JS files, and it says, hey, while you're getting this HTML, you're also going to need all these assets. In certain situations, there are times when using server push can cause performance degradation. The reason for that is just because you're pushing the assets sooner doesn't mean it's going to be better for the browser. And this is especially true if you're using something like a lot of JavaScript, because the browser then has to parse and eventually execute that JavaScript. And when you're sending a lot of things down the wire, especially on mobile devices, immediately it can cause the phone to just be slower. A mobile device in particular only has so much processing power at its disposal. And when you send it the HTML and you're like, oh, but you're also going to need all of this other stuff, and you just push it to the browser all at the same time, it now has to deal with all of that. So if you have a very bulky website, server pushing may cause more issues than it actually resolves. And there's a really good article on this, and I'll try and include it in the comments or the description below, but it's a really good article, and if you're interested, you can read it. But it goes into this in a very detailed fashion. Support badge, it just displays a small text and the footer, and that promotes them. Remote critical CSS generation, when this is disabled, the plugin will contain a version that generates it in the browser. So you visit the page and it'll generate it locally. It will use your server resources instead of the PageSpeed Ninja resources. I'll go ahead and enable this just to see what happens. I'm not particularly worried about breaking this website. Typically using a remote service is better, especially on very, for lack of a better word, just very underpowered servers. Using the remote service is much better. Sending anonymous statistics is fine. And over here. So what we're going to do is we're going to clear the entire cache. Everything. I want nothing in cache. And now I'm going to reload. Okay. So now we have some good news. We can visit the site and everything renders. And that is what we like to see. So now that we've just enabled it and we cleared the cache feature was honestly just something I had to do so that the front end would render. We can now begin to look at some stuff. So you could choose to exclude URLs from being combined. Now, this plugin should have smarter defaults than it does. It should not be combining my gist from GitHub. That will cause breakage. So you'll have to exclude the files here from being combined because this will break things. And we do not want things to break. And we definitely don't want to explode the cache size, which will cause the server resources to be much worse than they probably already were. Avoid landing page redirects will be implemented further. This is a warning when you test the website, like let's say you go to this website right here. The website is supposed to only serve to HTTPS. So by default, the website will go ahead and it'll redirect you to the HTTPS version if you connect to the HTTP version. The only way to really resolve this is to just not test the incorrect URL. Because even if your redirect time is really fast, you're still going to get flagged for the warning. So that's something you need to keep in mind. Enable compression, we'll just go ahead and enable gzip compression. You could just reorder the attributes, which, as it mentions here, is when you have a conflict with another extension. You shouldn't need to do this in most configurations. Maybe if you have another page caching plugin installed for some reason. Leverage browser caching. You will, this does a couple of things. So number one, it will add the expires headers in the htaccess file if you're on Apache. It will then try to load external CSS files locally and try to merge it, which is good. It'll do the same thing for scripts and try to do it for images. The concept here is by loading them locally, you're actually now able to set the expires headers, which will clear the warning. This is a good feature to have. It's just you need to be wary that loading external things locally can sometimes cause breakages. You see this mostly with third-party scripts. So if you're having an issue with a third-party service not working and you are using this plugin, disable the load external scripts feature. Reducing the server response time honestly just comes down to caching. As I mentioned here, it'll enable server-side page caching and the experimental caching for extra caching level for optimized pages. It'll use more disk space. There's not really a lot of good documentation of what this is, but it's experimental, so I wouldn't recommend using it because it means it's not ready for prime time. The caching time to live, as it mentions here, cache data will be invalidated after that X amount of period. It's basically the global cache period, how long the file will be cached. 1 day is the default at 1440 minutes. Typically something like 10 hours is a good amount, so 600 minutes would be ideal. DNS prefetch will automatically prefetch third-party URLs so that it detects on the page. So the fonts from Google APIs, Gravatar is another one that it'll do, and it lists some of them out up here. And these are the ones that it's going to preload. It will try to scan the entire document to find the files that it should cache, so just keep this in mind. The Minify CSS will go ahead and combine your CSS files, and you can modify how this will work. So there are a lot of options in here. Most of them do not matter. But you could choose to exclude files by just pasting the file in here. Try to do it without your URL, so just do /wp-content, the URL. You could choose to merge embedded styles in the head only, which is, or you can disable it or merge embedded styles everywhere. It doesn't really matter too much. Minify CSS method allows you to change the method from which the CSS file will be minified by. The res is just fine for most things. You can minify style attributes. That's fine. It might cause issues. Inline limit is fine at a default. Cross-file optimization is totally fine to be disabled. Keep extra link tag attributes. This will remove, so as it mentions here, don't merge a script if its link tag contains an extra attribute, which is an ID. Typically, you see this only with third-party services. What's a common one? Is it HubSpot? HubSpot or Wistia does this with their JavaScript files. At least they'll add an ID attribute to the script in their CSS file if you're using it. Don't merge those style sheets. You shouldn't need to do this for most websites. It's a fairly edge case situation, but if you need to keep the extra link tag attributes, by all means, you were able to do so. You can minify your HTML and modify what gets minified. It'll remove white space and comments by default. You could choose to remove Internet Explorer conditional tags if you don't care about Internet Explorer. Most of you won't. And you can remove the default attributes. It mentions here, remove attributes with default values and type equals text in the input tag. It'll reduce the total page size, but as it mentions here, disable in the case of conflicts with CSS selector doesn't match the input element. This can cause breakages, but it's not really worth what it says. Even HTML minified isn't really worth the amount of work it causes the server to do because it saves so little. Minify JavaScript, you should definitely be minifying your JavaScript and excluding the files here. You could choose to merge the embedded scripts, inline scripts. So as I mentioned here, merge embedded JavaScript in the blank code blocks. Disable the dynamically generated Embado script here. When you merge embedded JavaScript, you run into the issue of eventually your cache size will get so large because it's dynamic. And JavaScript tends to be dynamic for a number of reasons, particularly if you have elements that are dependent on the URL or they have a nonce. something that changes on page load to page load or page that they're on, or something that just is different for some reason, your page size can get quite large. It'll either be one JS file per page, or if it's combining a nonce, it'll be a new JS file on every single page load. So just be wary of the impacts that your server will have from this. The auto async feature, as I mentioned here, is basically it'll load it into non-render blocking space. So as it also mentions, it allows to relocate script tags for more efficient merging. Blocking scripts generates in-place HTML content. It should not be relocated. But if you're using blocking scripts such as Google AdSense, you need to disable this. It'll try to auto async basically everything, which will improve the render performance, but it will break things. Primarily sliders are common to breakage. This plugin is very much a heavy-handed approach. It can save you quite a bit in terms of performance, but it can also break a lot of things, and breaking things is never ideal, especially if you're optimizing a site that isn't your own. That's why I personally don't use this. Allow you to skip, as I mentioned here, short inline initialization scripts. So var x equals blank. An initialization script is commonly used something for like HubSpot forms. So there's the actual main JS, and then there's the initialization JS, which is what handles, hey, this form needs to load here. That's what this is excluding. You can modify the JavaScript method for minification. The default is fine, or, well, as it mentions here, optimizes JS for better performance. The optimized JS correspondingly will remove white space and unused code, none, or JS bin. JavaScript code is more common to breakages than CSS when you minify it, because there is just some funky JavaScript out there, quite frankly. So this is fine. You minify the event attributes, optimize the JavaScript in the event of on click or on submit, doesn't really matter. Cross-file optimization. You can wrap it with the try-catch wrapping. Try-catch wrappings can reduce performance for the browser, but for performance tests, it won't matter. Emoji loading, you could just choose not to load it. That's fine. That's what I would do. It'll optimize integrations with Facebook, Google+, Gravatar, various third-party JavaScripts. Totally fine. Eliminate the render blocking JavaScript and CSS in the above the fold content. This is that critical CSS I mentioned way in the beginning. It'll generate it. It'll insert it and load the CSS in an asynchronous fashion. Now, Google Fonts loading, set it to flash of unstyled text. Do not use the web font loader. The web font loader will cause more performance headaches on PageSpeed Insights than it's worth. The primary issue with the web font loader is it's JavaScript based and it's quite bulky. So it's a hindrance on mobile devices to save you maybe a few kilobytes. The only time I would imagine you using it is if you have such a large amount of Google fonts that the overhead of processing those fonts is more than the web font loader. But if you're doing that, then you're already you're just picking your poison at that point, because you have so many fonts loading that it's a degradation to your performance more so than the heavy JavaScript library. Most situations, just load it as the flash of unstyled text. It'll use font display swap. None, as I mentioned here, load the JavaScript asynchronously with a few seconds delay after the web page is displayed. This, as I mentioned here, can lead to side effects. It will load the JavaScript in a fashion that will not impact rendering at all the JavaScript. The issue with it is, though, because it's non-render blocking, features like Google Analytics may not function properly, or you'll be missing data. And that's because there is a delay. If a user comes on your page and bounces immediately, that data may not be captured. So they come on the page, 3 seconds later, they're gone. This will not track that data. Other services may just not work. There is one chat service, and I cannot think of its name, that will have an issue with this. And you just have to kind of live with it. You may not be able to use this feature, but if you can, you're going to get a huge improvement in PageSpeed Insight scores, and it's going to be a little bit wonky in mobile devices. Optimize images. What this will do is quite simple. It will compress the images, at least the JPEGs, to a certain quality. WordPress by default does 82, so you could probably lower this to like 80, 75. You should be fine in terms of image quality. Serving scaled images will try to fit the image to the container. You can use a fixed ratio for the image, or you could remove it. Fit is probably your best bet. This is a very hard image to use. Choose to wrap a wide image, which as it mentions here, wrap images that are wider than half of the screen into a centered span. This makes a floating element to fill the full horizontal size if it's wider than 50%. The problem with dynamically resizing images is it's never reliable. Because an element may have the width and height attributes declared, but then it's resized via JavaScript or via CSS. This happens all the time with page builders especially, where the image is automatically going to resize based on the container size, but the height and width attributes are going to be whatever the actual image size was. So these features are not all that reliable, so I highly recommend testing it after enabling it. Prioritizing visible content. Great feature. Lazy loads your images in iframes. Every site should do this. No script position will either be before or after your script tag. It doesn't really matter. You can choose to generate the source set as well. Automatically generate the source set attribute for rescaled images. That's fine. You can choose to skip a certain amount of images like your logo. So if you only have one above the fold image, like your logo, just set it to 1. Or if you have a big header image, you can skip 2. The vertical lazy load threshold will set the area plus the viewport. So this is how many pixels outside of your viewport before images are starting to load. For comparison, WordPress Rocket does 300. So you could set it to 100. And this basically just helps with downloading the image before it comes into the viewport. But you don't want to set it too large or you're eliminating the purpose of lazy loading. So 100 is probably a good amount, which is going to probably cause more images to be flagged in performance tests, but it's going to cause a better user experience overall. You can choose to load a low quality image placeholder. Frankly, I just wouldn't bother. It's just going to create more images and use more space. You can choose to remove embedded plugins. Remove all embedded plugins, Flash, ActiveX, and Silverlight. Most of you aren't going to worry about that, so you can ignore it. Configure the viewport. Viewport width in pixels, set 0 to use the device screen width. That's fine. Size content to the viewport doesn't even use, and this doesn't do anything, and this doesn't do anything. So congratulations, we've gone through the entire plugins settings. Now you might be wondering, is it worth it? Tricky question. The problem with this plugin isn't that it doesn't work. The problem with this plugin is you're going to drive yourself a little mad trying to get the settings to just work the way you want them to. Quite frankly, it's a bulky plugin and it's not easy to use, and it looks like this is working, surprisingly. This is also a very, very basic website, except for one important detail. The menu no longer exists. I guess it just wasn't important anymore. The menu's gone completely. That's a shame because you could see that it loads in for like a half second and then it just disappears. So even with very basic settings, it's still going to cause some problems. If we go to like the shop page, you can see the flash of unstyled content on that load in. What's amazing is we're not getting any JavaScript errors. All the main JavaScript functionality appears to work. Even the styles function, just the menu disappeared. This is a very basic website. Personally, if you can get the plugin to work and you fiddle with it long enough, it's a very good plugin, especially because it's free. You're not going to get a free plugin with this level of flexibility in it, but it's time consuming. It's very time consuming and you have to experiment. The more complicated that your website is, the more time you're going to sit here trying to figure out what it's breaking. I wouldn't really recommend using the login cache either for most websites. But as you can see here, it actually scores pretty well on the GT Matrix test, and we'll run it through PageSpeed Insights, but you know, it's also a very basic website. So would I use this plugin? No, because the amount of work you're going to spend getting this integrated without breaking things is not really worth it. And this got a 93, but I mean, it's a basic website. We could test it again with this disabled, but there's nothing in here inherently that really makes it any better than just loading something like WordPress Rocket. That's just really what the comparison is. And if we look at our, not our network payload, this plugin does a little bit of tricks to make the execution time much lower than it would be. But the advantage to this theme was it didn't have a lot of JavaScript. On very JavaScript heavy websites with more complicated themes like Avada, Divi, you're going to run into more issues. And this was a very basic theme overall. It's a fine plugin, but I wouldn't recommend it to the average user unless you have a lot of time. You'd be better off paying for something like WordPress Rocket, or Swift Performance Pro is another good one. You just got to pick whichever one's going to be easier for you to work with. This plugin, while being free, it's going to cause you a lot of headache. And if you're trying to optimize your website, the one thing you don't want to have to worry about already is the optimization plugin causing more issues than your website already had in performance issues. If you do have a question about this, though, you can feel free to ask in the comments below. For those of you who are wondering, yes, the menu issue is fixable. I'm just not going to fix it because it's going to vary for every theme, so it doesn't really matter too much for me to illustrate how to fix it for this specific site. But if you have a question, I will try to help you in the comments below. Make sure to like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.